Say what's cracking, YouTube? It's your boy 16 to life, and I'm back like I'm on a pro violation. Yard down! Now, for those of y'all that's new to my page, in 1994, I got arrested. I was eventually sentenced to 16 years plus life, and I served 24 years straight in the California prison system. During those times, I accumulated some good stories and some good insight on things related to prison, and I'm going to share some with y'all today. If you like the video, be sure to hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, hit that notification bell. That way, anytime I drop a story, you'll be notified ASAP Rocky, and you can hop on it whenever you're ready. Also, be sure to check out my YouTube playlist for some of my older stories. I got them put in certain categories, and I know you'll definitely find something that you like. Now, let's hop into this right here. Now, a lot of times, when people find out that I've done 24 years, they be like, damn, Chill, you done 24 years. What did you do during all that time? And, basically, they want to know how many of us spent our time in prison, right? And I think it's a rumor or a myth that people who go to prison don't have anything better to do than to sit down and work out all day, which is untrue. A lot of people think that's how some of the guys come out so big, is they just work out all day. Well, no. First and foremost, we're required to either have a job or be going to school. If you don't have your high school diploma, then you have to go get your GED. So now, depending on let's say you do have your GED or your high school diploma, and it's in your file. They want to make sure they're not just going to take your word for it. So you have to provide documented evidence that you have that. Then you're gonna have to get a job. Now, especially when I came to the pen in 1996, you still had some people in prison who were getting day for day, meaning that every day they done in prison, they got a day took off their sentence. So for the guys who were sentenced under those guidelines, they had first priority at having a job. Now, some of the jobs were you could work in the kitchen, you could be a clerk, you could be a porter, which is basically a janitor in the building. You could work on the yard crew and stuff like that. None of those jobs were highly were like paid real high. They weren't high paying jobs. You might start off at 8 cents an hour. On some of those jobs, you might get lucky and end up maxing out at 12 cents an hour. So basically, you might be lucky to make $12 or $13 a month. They also had, for those people who wanted to like learn a trade or something, they had vocational trades. They had graphic arts, and it just all depended on what institution that you happen to be in, because the vocational trade it varied depending on what pen that you was at, right? But they had graphic arts, they had milling cabinets. Some prisons you could learn how to make eyeglasses and stuff. You could mechanic, welding, underwater welding, upholstery. It just all depends. And of course, none of those vocational trades paid, they didn't have what they call in prison a pay number. A pay number is, when certain jobs you work at, you get like I said, the 8 cents or whatever. So these vocational trades, they didn't have pay numbers and stuff. And so now a select few prisons in California had what was known as PIA, which was the prison industries. And those were the jobs that was really coveted in prison. Some of those jobs might pay up to 85 cents or $1.10, $1.20 a day. So with some overtime, I'd seen dudes who worked in those jobs bring home, $220, $240, which is basically pretty good money when you're in prison. Everybody in prison is not necessarily fortunate enough to have people on the outside helping them out and providing them with money. So it's always good to have extra money in prison, because see, they feed us in the morning at about 6 o'clock. Then by the time I got to prison, there was no lunch in terms of a hot lunch. Most prisons had started giving out a sack lunch. So then you'd get fed dinner maybe about 5 o'clock, 5:30, 6 o'clock. And then, so, a dude being 195 pounds, 230, 40 pounds or whatever, you definitely would get hungry like around 8, 9 o'clock at night. So it always helped to be able to have some extra money, on your books and stuff. And the people who was working in prison industries, they got paid pretty well. Some of the jobs in prison industries are known as PIA. You know, you might make boots, or you might make jackets or clothing for the other institutions. One of the PIAs I seen was the license making those tags for the cars that go in the cars. They had a few different, a few different things up in there and stuff. And then right before I left in 2018, I forget the name of it, but they had a crew who was starting to build, like buildings were being built at the prison that I was at. And, they was having the people who was on the yard work and help with the construction and stuff like that. And of course, those jobs were extremely sought after as well. I think people may have been making $2 to $3 an hour. So stuff like that really helped. And then also, so in the mornings, like, okay, depending on what job you had, we would eat breakfast like about 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning. Then you may go to your job, get up at 8 o'clock, and they would do work release. Then they let people out who worked, and then you may go, from 8 o'clock to 2:30. Now it just all depended on what shift you was at, what shift you was on, and where you was working. And then some people would get off, and then other people would go to work maybe like around 3 o'clock to maybe about 8 o'clock. It just all depend on where you worked at and stuff like that. And so some jobs came with certain perks. You could work in the visiting room. And I think that pretty much goes without saying. You had a lot of people who wanted to go to the visiting room and they could respectfully people watch. Other people wanted to go to the visiting room because, of course, that's where a lot of the drugs are being brought in at. So if you was a porter out there in the visiting room, you may have a buddy or something, that's bringing in some drugs, or, and that was some extra income for you if you chose to go that route. Me, of course, I never chose to work in the visiting room because it was no secret to the police that that's where a lot of the drugs came in at. You'd have a friend maybe come visit, or you would be out there working, and one of your homies from the yard might come visit, and then you make your way over there to maybe take a picture, act like you was handing him some toys and stuff for his kids to play with or whatever, and then he might pass you the drugs, or maybe have his girlfriend pass them to you. And so to me, that was always a high risk job. I didn't see too many people who went to the visiting room and bring in drugs not eventually get busted. Plus you had a lot of people talking and stuff like that. So that was always a high risk job. But then you also had working in the medical facility at the prisons. A lot of people like to work at those jobs because they was going to be in close proximity with a lot of women. Another cool job that had some good perks was the bakery, depending on what prison that you was at. Because at certain times, you would be in the bakery and you could make special little cakes. You might make cookies for everybody, you and your crew back there, depending on what type of leverage you had with the CO who was working back there. And it may not sound like much, but for a person that's been in jail for 10, 15 years, a peanut butter cookie or a chocolate chip cookie or whatever, a special cake back there is a whole lot. That's one of the most things I think people miss most outside of their family and women is good food in prison. So it just all depended where you were at. I had a buddy by the name of Shake. He was out of San Diego, I believe Oceanside, and he happened to work in the kitchen at CMC East, and he had him a pretty lucrative hustle going on. He had been in there for a long time, and he was the main cook. So after they cooked the food, he would make hamburgers for people and chicken sandwiches, burritos. In the morning, he'd make special pancakes and stuff, and he'd charge people. And at this particular prison, we had a form of currency known as a ducat. You could go to the regular canteen and buy up to 50 ducats, and these ducats were used just like money. So then people would give him the ducats, and then you had other people who would want to purchase these ducats to go gamble or go buy sodas or go buy drugs or whatever. Then he'd resell the ducats to them. He would have their family wire him $50 or however many ducats they wanted to purchase. And once the money arrived and he was sure that it was there, he would give them the ducats. Because see, everybody, like I said, once again, don't have family out there. Everybody's not fortunate enough to even go to the store. And then you had some people who didn't have their family send them money. I was one of them. if I could avoid it, because we had restitution. Restitution was a fine imposed on us at the time of our sentencing by the judge. Now, when I first got to the pen, restitution was only 22%. So if someone was to send me $100, I'd still get 78. But after about maybe 9-10 years, restitution had hiked all the way up to 55%. And so someone would send you $100, all you would get is $45. So you would have a lot of people who would purchase ducats off the yard, and then they could go to the store, they could shop, they could do whatever, So that was one of the reasons ducats at that prison was extremely necessary. And like I said, he had a real lucrative business going with it, with working in the kitchen. I forgot exactly how much money he told me he was making each week doing that stuff, but it was a lot of money, And many times myself, I would go buy hamburgers, cheeseburgers, special little things that we didn't get in the regular chow hall, Now, of course, you have a lot of people who would spend their time in prison, playing chess, playing cards, exercising, sports, stuff like that. I know, I knew several guys who after work would come out to the yard and they would just run laps, just throw their headphones on, run laps. Now I realize probably a lot of those guys was just trying to, free their mind and get a peace of mind, and maybe just somewhat mentally remove themselves from being incarcerated, because after you do a whole lot of time, the same routine every single day comes extremely boring and monotonous. And regardless of what prison you are in, California has, I think, like 32 male prisons. But regardless of whatever prison you're in, it's pretty much the same. You have certain things that may change here and there, but it's pretty much the same. And so at certain prisons though, like they had, like I remember I've been at a couple of prisons, they actually had band rooms. They had tubas, guitars, keyboards, and stuff like that. So you'd have some people who joined the band, learn to play music and pass time like that. I had a homie who I grew up with who's extremely talented. I've been trying to get this guy to make some music. I mean, this dude is, I would literally put him at Dr. Dre status, if you guys are familiar with Dr. Dre, when it comes to making beats. He's in Vegas right now, but he's extremely gifted on the keyboard, the drums, the guitar, and his thing was just chilling in the band room, and he didn't care if he was playing gospel music, R&B, rap, whatever it was. He just loved to play the keyboard, and that's how he spent a lot of his time. You have some people who were handymans. When I got to prison, remember, it was 1996, so we still had Walkmans, CD players. Some people still had black and white TVs. A few people still had record players and stuff, because before I got to the prison, maybe about 15-20 years, dudes were allowed to have record players in some prisons. And so you had handymans who they fixed all these things, and some of these guys in there were extremely talented. You might go to a dude's cell looking to sell. This dude has 15-20 radios up in there, 4 or 5 TVs, and he's fixing stuff, and so that's the way some people just done their time. Of course, gambling was always a big part of how people done their time in prison. I never really got too much into gambling, because some people in there was really gambling for their livelihood. Like I said earlier, everyone doesn't have somebody on the outside looking out for them. And so some people in there were, gambling for their next meal, gambling for next week's, as a way of eating and stuff. And so some of these guys weren't sincere. Some of these guys were slick, and, some of them had no intentions on paying if they didn't have to. Anytime they felt they could get over, they would try to get over. And things like that would definitely make me mad, because I had every intention to pay if I lost. And so I just figured out it was best for me not even to get myself involved in that situation. I had a good friend by the name of Slim. He was from Detroit. I looked him up recently and can't find him, so I'm assuming that he's paroled, But Detroit ran a gambling shack pretty much. So whether you wanted to bet on baseball, football, basketball, he would print the tickets. He would print these tickets out, and he would have people who would go pass his tickets out to everybody on all 4 yards of the prison. who, everybody who liked to gamble and stuff like that. And so that would be his thing. He would immerse himself in that, and he would have some pretty good weeks. Sometimes he'd make $1,000. Sometimes he might get hit kind of hard, especially around football season. It seems like everybody loves football season, and from time to time he might come to me and ask me if I had 300 or 400 ducats. He had a bad week and stuff, but he'd always pay me back. But it's just a lot of different stuff to do in prison, to break up the monotony of being in prison. You had some dudes work on the yard crew, which is outside taking care of the yard, taking care of the grass and stuff like that. Now, there were times, keep it 100, I might look at this dude and say, man, Dan, this dude is taking care of this state grass better than he probably take care of his grass at home. But now, being a little older, being a little wiser and more mature, I realized that it wasn't necessarily the prison grass they was concerned with. It was just a way to remove their mind from what was going on in prison. The madness of just being in prison. So they just, get caught up in their work and take pride in just doing that, just to stay away from what's going on in prison. Because I would say maybe after about 14, 15 years in prison, I started to feel like I had pretty much done it all in prison, in terms of, you didn't heard a million war stories, you didn't seen a bunch of dudes getting beat up, and all the things that was interesting to me when I first came in was no longer interesting. I was tired of all that stuff. When I first got to prison, somebody might say, hey man, J-Lo was to get smashed by a certain car. Oh, is that right? Oh yeah, I'm going out there to see that. Later on, about 14, 15 years later, hey man, J-Lo gonna get smashed. Oh, is that right? Yeah, I'm going inside, because who wants to be outside laying on the ground for 3 or 4 hours when something happened, just going through the same old stuff. Like I said, after a while, the things that fascinated me when I first got to prison no longer fascinated me. And for me, being a lifer, not knowing when or if I'd ever get out of prison, that stuff just wasn't appealing anymore. You'd have some people who were jailhouse lawyers, and they spent their time studying law, trying to gain their freedom, and maybe if they couldn't gain their freedom, trying to help other people gain their freedom. So it's just a lot of different ways people pass time. You had some people who of course would be outside hanging with the homies. You'd have people rapping, all types of stuff. So it's many ways to pass time in prison, man. If you didn't have a job, or if you wasn't going to school, because they use those things as incentives. If you didn't have a job, or you wasn't going to school, then you would only get one phone call, one 15-minute phone call every month. You would be able to spend less money when you went to the canteen. If you happen to be at a prison that did offer night yard, you couldn't go to night yard. You couldn't go to the yard on the weekends at all. So certain things like this was an incentive to make people work, take a vocational trade or whatever. But anyway, people always ask me about what were some of the ways that people pass time in prison. And like I said earlier, I think everybody thinks that, everybody in prison works out all day long. And also, I would think that probably only about maybe 30-40% of people even work out in prison. It's really not like everybody thinks that everybody's in there just working out all day long. You have a lot of people that don't work out in prison as well, So anyway, you already know what it is. It's your boy 16 to Life. Resume normal program.